So let's talk about creatine. The first thing that I'll say is that there are many people that are much more researched on creatine than I am. However, I can use what I've learned from these individuals to give an opinion on creatine. So inside the cell, creatine is in the form of creatine monophosphate, meaning that it's creatine bound to one phosphate molecule. And the real function of creatine is to hand this phosphate molecule off to another molecule called ADP. And ADP stands for adenosine diphosphate. So you may remember from biology class that in order for us to energize any reaction inside the body, we use a molecule called adenosine triphosphate. And this is an adenosine molecule with three phosphate molecules attached. And the way that we actually create energy is by breaking the bond between the second and third phosphate, releasing an inorganic phosphate, which is just a phosphate that isn't bound to anything, and creating adenosine diphosphate. We then will recycle this adenosine diphosphate back into adenosine triphosphate just by adding a phosphate molecule. And typically this will occur while you're resting. And the reason that we actually rest between sets in the gym is to replenish this adenosine triphosphate. But interestingly, what creatine can do is actually simply just donate this phosphate bond it has to adenosine diphosphate, regenerating ATP. And it can actually do this in the middle of a strength training set and allow us to get 12 reps instead of 11, simply because we have more energy available to get that last rep due to the formation of ATP resulting from creatine. So let's first talk about natural sources of creatine. This would come in the form of meat. Any sort of animal product is going to be extremely abundant in protein. You get about 5 grams of creatine from eating 1 pound, and you would get about 2 grams from chicken or fish. And the recommended supplementation for creatine is typically 5 grams a day. And I started off the video by saying that creatine supplementation at 5 grams a day appears to be extremely effective for exercise performance. However, increasing dosages up to 20 or beyond appears to actually be able to increase our cognitive function. And extremely high doses of creatine have and still are being used for the treatment of different cognitive disorders and as a recovery protocol for any sort of brain injury. So above 5 grams, the muscles will typically be saturated. And when we exceed this, some of this creatine can pass through what's called the blood-brain barrier. And this is simply a barrier that sits around our brain that only allows specific molecules from our blood circulation into the brain. And the reason why it appears that we need such high doses of creatine is simply because there aren't that many creatine transporters located on the brain. So what we lack in transporters, we kind of have to make up for by simply just the volume of creatine in the bloodstream. I did forget to mention that the body can actually produce its own creatine, and we produce between 1 and 2. But if we really want to increase the brain concentration of creatine, we would take a very high dose supplement. And fortunately, we haven't really seen any sort of negative effects of creatine supplementation. Of any supplement in sports, I think creatine and caffeine are the most studied supplements in all of sports. And to this day, the only research I've come across where creatine could actually be harmful is in a case of extreme kidney disease, because creatine is broken down into creatinine and filtered out by the kidney. So creatine supplementation in someone in maybe stage 4 or 5 kidney failure simply just doesn't have the kidney capacity to filter out this creatine. And the other population is simply just someone who may have a genetic defect in their ability to absorb and utilize creatine effectively. For this individual, supplementing with creatine could just cause some adverse consequences. But 99.9% of people do not have this genetic alteration. And unless, once again, you have some sort of organ issues, specifically with the kidney, creatine is one of the safest supplements on the planet. And it's actually a supplement that I would consider, because unlike most other supplements, it's extremely difficult to get a lot of creatine from food, unless you're on the carnivore diet where you're eating pounds of meat a day. Adding in additional creatine does help to saturate all of the creatine stores inside the body. The last thing I'll mention, and is something that I've written about, is that I would actually recommend taking 2-gram doses. The reason for this is when we take 5 grams of creatine, a lot of times we'll only absorb a few grams. So the rest isn't absorbed, and all this does is create expensive urine. So I would recommend, if you're going to take 5 grams a day, try and space it out as often as possible. And I don't think you need to get extreme about this, but maybe trying doses between 1 and 2 grams multiple times a day could help increase your creatine absorption. So, in summary, creatine is both safe and effective, and has a substantial amount of research behind it. And because it does appear that going above and beyond what we can get from food does bring about positive effects, it's one of the supplements that I would recommend if you have the finances for it.